Hello and welcome to our online learning segment on teaching with census records. My name is Jessica Ellison and I'm a teacher educator in K-12 programs and services at the Minnesota Historical Society. You can reach me at jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. All of the links and activities that you'll see in this segment will be included in a Google Doc that's linked at the very end of this presentation, so you don't have to feel rushed to write down all the URLs that you see here today. Let's get started. Teaching with census records. Why should we teach with census records? Where do we find them? And how do we use them in classrooms? These are the things we're going to be focusing on in this 10-minute segment. What is a census record? Well, it counts the residents of the United States every 10 years. It's mandated by a section of the Constitution, and it's primarily to determine how many seats each state gets in the House. They're released 72 years after the census year. So the most recent census records that were released was the 1940 census, which was released in 2012. The 1890 records, unfortunately, were destroyed by fire, so those are very sparse. But otherwise, there are great records from every other census year. State census records were also taken, but they were taken more randomly, and so you can't necessarily count on them as regularly as the every 10-year federal census. So why should we use census records? They tell amazing stories about families, about jobs, about migration and immigration. This census record, as you can see featured on the page, is of Martin Luther King when he was a young man living with his parents and his siblings. And just to see his name in the census record gives you a thrill that here was this real person who was counted by the census just like everyone else before he became famous. Census records also allow us to observe patterns and changes and draw conclusions about different populations. It also helps us, especially if we look at the different lists of questions from census to census, to understand changing ideas about things like race and gender and other demographics, because the questions did change every year from 1790 to 2010, which was the most recent census year. So why do they need you? This is a difficult document to look at. The handwriting is done in cursive, which it's difficult for people to read, and it's also a lot of information with really tiny print. So that's point number one. Point number two, there's a lot of social information here that you might need to help your students analyze and dissect. For example, this record right here, which is from the 1850 census in Minnesota, shows a family of 4 people: James Thompson, his wife Mary, and their 2 children. They were listed, the husband and the 2 children, as mulatto. That's what that M means in that final column. Mary Thompson has nothing listed for her race. She was an American Indian, and in 1850 there was no notation for the federal census for American Indians. You could only choose white, black, or mulatto. So it's interesting in its absence of information, and this is something that you would need to help your students uncover. Primary source analysis, such as the one we just talked about, is a skill that needs to be modeled and rehearsed. And census records are a lot deeper and a lot more complicated than some other primary sources. So it's important to provide adequate context and then lead off with warm-up activities or practice as a class looking at these records. But the most important thing is to make primary source analysis a regular activity in your classroom. So here's resources on a list that will show you where to get primary sources. They will show you census data and history, and then original and transcribed census records. So you can find things like John Adams in the census 4 different times. The best place to start is census.gov. This is the Federal Census Bureau with all the information from 1790 to 2010. You can see the lists of questions and compiled census data, as well as things like maps and questionnaires. The Internet Archive is a very interesting place to get information from the census because you can search by state or year. It's not a robust search engine, but there are thousands and thousands of pages of original census data. So they're not transcribed or word searchable, but it's very impactful to see the original page of the census. The 1940 census, as I said, was the last one that was released to the public. And the National Archives has a search engine on their website of the 1940 census, which you can search by city, by county, by state, even by street. And there's a whole section called Census Research 101 that helps walk you through how to research on the census records. Census Finder is another good place to find a whole collections of census records. You can look by a particular state. You can even look in the United Kingdom, Canada, and some American Indian records. They have both federal and state census records. All right, so how do we use these in the classroom? First, we need to get kids used to seeing census records. You can share original pages. Find family members, especially in the 1940 census. Review the lists of census questions. You can see how they change every year and how they begin adding things like different categories for race and how they begin adding other people's names other than the head of household starting in 1850. You can also share census records listing famous people, which is a really fun one. They build historical thinking skills. It's not necessarily content that we're focused on here. It's more about skills. And now these records are subject to human error because they were handwritten and they were taken down by a human, so they're imperfect records. But it makes for great storytelling and a great way for students to learn to be critical of primary sources. So you can start doing things like compare and contrast. So Joseph Pulitzer, who was a newspaper editor, is featured in the census a number of different times, but you can look at 1880 and 1900 to do a compare and contrast and look for things like inaccuracies and household change. In 1880, he lived in St. Louis with his family and a couple of servants, and he was listed as being born in Hungary. In 1900, he lived in New York with his family. He was listed as being born in Austria, and the image that you see on the screen, those are just his servants. He had 17 servants living with him. So you can look at the changes that he made in those 20 years because he started making a lot of money, and then the inaccuracies in where the census listed as his birthplace, and also the birthplaces of his children, which were wrong a couple of different times as well. Causes and consequences. If you look at Jesse Owens in the 1940 census, and Jesse Owens was an African-American athlete who was an Olympic medalist a number of times, and when you look at the birthplaces of the African-Americans listed in his neighborhood in 1940, it's excellent evidence of the Great Migration, because a lot of the older residents were born in the South and a lot of the younger residents were born in Ohio, which is where they were currently living. And that really shows evidence of how many African Americans moved north. And also look at the occupations of residents to look at African American life in the 1940s. Change over time. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, from 1860 to 1880, her occupation changes dramatically. This is 1860, and as you can see in the blank space next to her name, there's no occupation listed. By 1880, however, she was listed as authoress, and even they wrote the name of the book that she wrote above authoress. So she had been very famous at this point for over 20 years, and they even included that in the census. This will help you find and analyze sources too when you track famous people especially. So Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House on the Prairie books, appears in the census a couple of times. In 1880, you can track her family's migration simply by looking at the birthplace of the daughters in the family. They were all born in different places, so you can see how the family moved. In 1940, which is where these pictured census records are from, there's kind of an absence of information. By 1940, she had published at least 5 of her Little House on the Prairie books and presumably was making some money. But if you look at the blank spaces at the bottom line, there's nothing listed for her occupation and nothing listed for how much money she was making. And it's pretty safe to say that you could have listed author and how much money she was making, but that information is absent, and so it's a good opportunity to talk about why. You can also draw conclusions. This is John F. Kennedy's family in 1940, and you can make some pretty interesting conclusions about his family and the neighborhood. They have servants and most of their neighbors did too, so it was probably a wealthy neighborhood. It's a very famous family. You can recognize some of these names, such as, of course, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and you can also see that a lot of the sons were absent. Where were they? It's a good way to draw conclusions about what you see in the sources. Understanding bias is huge in the census records. This is a census record of Jim Thorpe, who was an American Indian athlete at the turn of the century. This is his census record from 1900, where he is listed with his family, and his identity is listed as Sac and Fox, so he was listed as American Indian. In 1920, he is listed as white, and so it's really interesting to see why that might have changed in 20 years. The other thing that you can do that's really fascinating is you can follow the trail of ordinary people in the census. So this is a little story I want to share to finish up. I found a letter in the Minnesota Historical Society records from the 1870s during the grasshopper plagues in Minnesota. And it was written by this man named G.A. Eggy. And all I knew about him was his name, the date, and where he lived. Well, the letter was very sad. He wrote to the governor saying that they had no food, they had no resources, and that he was afraid he and his family were going to starve because of the grasshopper plagues. So I was interested. Did his family survive the grasshopper plagues? I went to the census records and found out that yes, in fact, his entire family survived the grasshopper plagues because I was able to find them in the 1880 census, and I found him in the census all the way up through 1920, and he lived in the same area for the rest of his life with his wife. So as you can see, census records are a really amazing way to tell stories about the past of either famous or ordinary people. The URL that you see in the top bullet there is the link to the Google Doc that has all of these URLs that were mentioned and all the activities as well. So you can copy down that URL and access that Google Doc. Census records are very complicated documents, but they're wonderful for addressing historical thinking skills and for telling stories about people, whether they're famous or they're regular just like you and me. And above all, they make history real. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. Thank you.